Good morning, New Testament Survey students. This is Mr. Albers, and we will be covering Paul's first missionary journey today from Acts 13 and 14. This is the back half of the guided notes that you received in class yesterday, and we are going to be covering the first of, it turns out, 3 trips that Paul made that are recorded in the book of Acts throughout the back half of the book. So if you don't have your guided notes, go ahead and grab those now. And you'll notice at the top we have, we'll start with a little summary statement of the entire trip from the end of Acts 14, that Paul and Barnabas, after they visited a final few places, they sailed to Antioch, where they had been commended to the grace of God for the work that they had fulfilled. So they've come full circle. They started at the Church of Antioch, which we remember was a diverse, multi-ethnic church where the gospel was not just being proclaimed to Jews, but to Greeks as well. They had been sent off by that church to these various areas in what was called Asia Minor, or is now Turkey. They had fulfilled that mission. They arrived back at Antioch, they gathered the church together, they declared all that God had done with them and how, and here's kind of our key phrase, he had opened a door of faith to the nations or to the Gentiles. And that's kind of the theme for today. So let's look a little more closely at what that looked like. So here's a map. You hopefully have received a handout that will allow you to trace the 3 missionary journeys of Paul. You can do it now from this map, or you can do it from a map in your Bible, or you can Google to get, I guess, as precise as you want to get. But just a couple of places to point out, right? Here's Antioch, right here, where they're sailing from. They made their way first to the island of Cyprus and then up into Asia Minor, and they go around through these different places and ended up sailing back to Antioch, okay? And then just to make sure we're orienting ourselves, here's Palestine down here, right? The promised land. Damascus is here, where Saul had his Damascus Road experience. Rome is over here. This is where the gospel is going to end up by the end of Acts. And then we've got, Italy, we've got Greece here. This will be the site of Paul's second and third missionary journeys, will be in here for the most part. But this is first missionary journey. So may not look super impressive distance-wise to us, but especially for, 2,000 years ago, this is a pretty good hike that he and Barnabas took. So let's talk about some of the things that helped the gospel spread. Some of these we've covered in class, but there are 2 main ones that we're going to flesh out. The first is the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace. What was the Roman peace? Well, at this time, the Roman Empire had a pretty good hold of the lands in question around Palestine, and particularly to the west. All right, so they built a network of roads. In fact, if you go to Europe, there are still some roads that are in use today that were built by the Romans. They were very good at this, not because they were altruistic, but mainly so that they could move troops very quickly, so that if any part of the empire was not paying their taxes or was threatening to rebel, they could move the army swiftly to quench that flame of rebellion, so to speak. No borders within the Roman Empire. It doesn't mean that there weren't different provinces, but there were no checkpoints, if we could put it that way. So Paul, throughout all of his travels, never actually leaves the Roman Empire. And so that makes things simpler. It doesn't mean that there were no problems, period, but it just meant that he didn't have to necessarily worry about switching into a new government, right? New language, new system of operating. He was within the same, you almost might say the same country, so to speak, just going from state to state. That's not a perfect analogy, but it's close enough to do the job for us. And no wars. I mean, obviously this doesn't mean that nobody ever rose up against Rome at this time, but by and large there were no major wars going on in this time. Obviously, when there's a war going on, it's very difficult to travel in and out of the regions affected. So the fact that there are no wars going on, not because everybody's happy per se, but because Rome is the most powerful force on the block, and there's nobody who's really able to stand against them at this time. Paul is able to go on this nice network of roads with no borders and no armed conflict to slow him down. Okay, and a common language, and this is of course Greek. The knowledge of the Old Testament was spreading mostly amongst Jews who were Greek-speaking Jews or Hellenistic Jews who had their own translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint or the 70. That's, LXX is Roman numeral 70, right? Because it's according to the story, there were either 70 or 72 Jewish translators who worked on the original translation of the Pentateuch. Anyhow, so they had that, but because it was translated into Greek, that gave anybody who spoke Greek access to the Word of God without having to learn Hebrew, which most Gentiles wouldn't be doing. And the New Testament, of course, is evidence of this because the entire New Testament is written in what's called Koine Greek. And Koine, let's write that out, is the Greek word for common, meaning that this was the basic Greek that you would learn and speak if it wasn't your native language. So it's the language of the marketplace, language of commerce, language of culture, we might say, in the Roman Empire. And so it was a language that most people understood. So when the New Testament authors wrote letters or wrote accounts of the life of Christ, they wrote in Greek to reach the widest possible audience. So it was the lingua franca of the day. And that's a big help too, right? If you're trying to spread a message, language barriers can really slow that down. And those are challenges. Those are challenges that missionaries still face today and that Christian missionaries have faced since this time. But the fact that Greek was so widespread as a common language really helped the spread of the gospel in these early days in this part of the world. All right, so some patterns to consider as Paul and Barnabas went on their way. And we're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking, at least on this trip, about everything that happened to them in each city. Hopefully you did your assigned SRJ reading on that, and so you know some of the stories. They're very good stories. But for the sake of time, we're going to focus in on some common patterns, okay? So question 8, we did 7 on the last slide. Where did Paul and Barnabas generally start preaching when they arrived at a new city? Well, their common practice, their pattern was they would start at the synagogues, which were, I say Jewish churches, that's really kind of backwards because the early Christian church, the local churches, were more modeled on the synagogues, right? The synagogues came first, and the synagogues were, kind of like we would think of as local churches. You would meet there on Saturday, on the Sabbath, to worship, to hear the word of the Lord read if you had copies of that, and to pray. And if you had a rabbi, the rabbi would lead that, or if not, some elder man in the community, or maybe somebody would travel through and be able to give a word of encouragement or something similar to what we might think of as a sermon. Regardless, that would be the center of Jewish worship in a city that was far from Jerusalem, right? Far from the temple, which was still standing in Jerusalem at this time, although it would be destroyed in the year 70. So Paul and Barnabas typically started in the synagogues. Why? Well, they say specifically in Acts 13, it's necessary that the word of God be spoken first to the Jews. Paul references this in Romans. He says, the gospel is displays the righteousness of God through faith, from faith to faith, and it's the power of God for salvation to all who believe, first to the Jew and then to the Gentile. And so we looked earlier this week. It's not that God's showing partiality, so to speak, but there's a priority that's given to the Jewish people to be the first to hear the word. because they have the heritage of God calling them out of Egypt, bringing them into the land. They're the ones the promises are coming through, right? Jesus, the fulfillment of all those prophecies, is Jewish, right? And that's on purpose. The 12 apostles, Jewish, right? The witnesses to Jesus' resurrection, the Old Testament prophets, Jewish. And so it's natural that they would be the first ones, although not the only ones, to receive the message. Okay? They also would be the natural first audience because they had the most Old Testament background, so they would be in the best position to understand the preaching of the gospel, right? They had the background of the sacrifices, the tabernacle, the temple, the promises to Abraham to have an offspring to bless the nations, the promises to David to have an offspring who would reign forever. The prophets, the prophecies of Isaiah that the servant of the Lord would bear the sin of his people, that he would be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, that he would be a light to the Gentiles. So the Jews had this background, so they would be the ones who you would think would be the most ready to accept the message. Okay, what was that message? Well, we get a good long example of a sermon in Acts chapter 13, and I just want to pick out a few key elements of this. The first one is that Paul gives kind of a brief Old Testament survey message, doesn't he? He traces the history of Israel. He hits on some high points. The Exodus is a big high point, right? It's a defining moment in Israel's history when God rescued them from slavery, when he single-handedly brought them out, from Egypt, parted the Red Sea, and they walked through it on dry land, and then he fed them in the wilderness, gave them his law, and brought them into the land. David is another high point, right? David, the great king, the man after God's own heart, who was promised an eternal dynasty and offspring who would reign forever. And then it's easy to jump from David to Jesus, right? David himself never fulfilled all the hopes of Israel. He died. He was a sinful man, but Jesus showed up as the heir and the offspring of David to do the things that were foretold, to not see decay, but rather to overcome death and to rise and to bear the sin of his people. And this is the thing that the prophets talked about. So this sermon that Paul gives very heavily pulls from the prophets. We see the prophet Isaiah referenced. We see prophecies in the book of Psalms referenced. We see a verse from Habakkuk, of all places, quoted. And so there's a very clear theme that everything that the Old Testament talked about has come true in Jesus. In fact, a very poignant part of this is in chapter 13, verses 32 and 33. Right in the middle of the sermon, Paul says, "We bring you the good news that what God promised to the fathers, he has fulfilled to us, their children, by raising Jesus." So Paul's saying God made these promises to our fathers, our ancestors. We, the children, we, the descendants, have seen the fulfillment. It's Jesus in his resurrection. And the sermon concludes by offering forgiveness of sins through Jesus alone. By him, everyone who believes is freed from everything from which you could not be freed by the law of Moses. And so Paul says the law of Moses, not that it's wrong or bad, but it has served its purpose and it could not actually deal with your sin. Jesus can. Jesus, the one that Old Testament history and prophecy point to, is the point of the sermon, right? And so we could kind of diagram it like this. Maybe reminds us of that saying, right? The Sunday school answer, the answer is always Jesus. Well, in a sense it is, right? There's a very real truth behind that, and this sermon kind of illustrates that. Okay, obviously it doesn't mean that every single question anybody ever asks, the answer is Jesus, but there is truth to the fact that this is centered around Jesus. It's pointing to Jesus. Jesus is the fulfillment, the culmination of Israel's history and of the promises and of the covenants. Okay, so who generally responds most positively to the gospel in these chapters of Acts? Well, somewhat surprisingly, maybe to our ears, it's typically the Gentiles, right? This sermon we just looked at in Acts 13, there are some Jews that want to hear more. There's some who actually beg to be told this more. But there are also some who begin to push back against what Paul and Barnabas are saying and end up even scoffing. And so Paul and Barnabas say, well, since you reject the message, we are going to turn to the Gentiles, which is going to fulfill the prophetic hope. The prophets never painted a picture of a fulfillment that was Israel only with no other inclusion of any other nations. No, on the contrary, the picture of the prophets was all the nations will come and join in the blessing. The Jews, many of them, not all. I mean, and let's remember, Paul and Barnabas are Jews, right? This is not the Jewish people completely rejected God and the Gentiles were great. But many Jews had a very difficult time accepting the idea of a Messiah who hung on a cross. Hanging on a cross, hanging on wood, was a clear sign of the curse of God according to the Old Testament law. And we recognize that Jesus did step into a place where he was cursed by God, not because of his own sin, but because of the sin of you and me. And he accepted that curse. And then he was raised again by God because he fulfilled his mission. But for many of the Israelites, that did not fit the paradigm that they had for what the Messiah was going to do. And not only that, it was offensive. They scoffed at it. They completely rejected that idea. And Paul and Barnabas recognize that this is a fulfillment of prophecies like this one from Isaiah. I have made you a light for the Gentiles, that you may bring salvation to the ends of the earth. Maybe also reminds us of Acts 1:8. And so in his providence, in his sovereignty, God is even using the sin of some of his people, the Israelites, to be a mechanism to push the gospel out to even more people and to break down barriers. And so the gospel goes out to people that historically have been excluded, not because God excluded them, but because in the working of history, for a Gentile to come to God in the Old Testament, they had to come to Israel and join themselves to the Jewish nation. They had to submit to all of the parts of the Old Testament law, which included circumcision if you were a male, which included some purification, which included the diet, which included all of the ceremonial aspects of the law. You essentially had to become Jewish. And as we've started to talk about and will continue to talk about, with the coming of Christ, that requirement is done away with because Christ, the substance, has come and he builds a kingdom that's full of people from every tribe and nation and tongue. And so in these chapters, we see, by and large, not entirely, but by and large, the Gentiles tend to be more receptive. Again, it'd be overly simplistic to say in the book of Acts, Jews reject, Gentiles accept. No, it's much more complicated than that. Paul and Barnabas are Jews, right? There are many Jews that accept the word. There are many Gentiles who reject it, right? But we do see a very clear theme that the gospel is pushing into new places. It's pushing down barriers. And isn't that just like God to do? And so finally, last thing we want to talk about, one more thing that Paul and Barnabas did as they planted churches, right? As people believed, they would then organize into local churches, which were based off the synagogue model. We mentioned that earlier. Paul and Barnabas would then appoint elders in every church. An elder would just be a leader of the church. The word is the Greek presbyteros, which is where the word Presbyterian is derived from. Literally means an older man, right? An elder. Respect your elders, right? That's the idea. So people that had experience and had maturity and wisdom, presumably with age, were appointed. And this is significant because it showed that Paul and Barnabas were expecting the churches and equipping the churches to be self-sustaining. They were not just meant to be little places where they had to wait for Paul and Barnabas to come give instructions before they could function. It also shows that Paul and Barnabas knew that those churches needed to last long term. They needed to be able to continue to encourage the believers in their area and evangelize and proclaim the gospel and bring new believers in. And so they needed their own leadership structure. And so Paul and Barnabas put that in place. And whatever church you go to, it may have a slightly different way of organizing who's the leadership within the church, but there's some form of leadership in the church, and that goes back to the very beginning. So those are some key patterns to consider in Paul's first missionary journey. We've already mentioned he and Barnabas return, and they report their success, and that God has opened a door to the Gentiles. This is a continuing theme in the book of Acts. And we will see that as much as it brings rejoicing and it's a glorious thing, it also provokes pushback within the church. And it provokes tension, and it provokes things that the early church had to deal with. So that we will leave towards future lessons, but that's the first missionary journey of Paul.